Good day. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the topic of artificial intelligence and detecting corruption through technology. I'm Justin Barfoot, Chief Information Security Officer for Sabatel Technologies in Canada and Niska Group in Belgium. My personal background is cybersecurity services, having spent most of my career in the intelligence community within Canada and the United States. I personally specialize in pen testing, red teaming, threat emulation, and general insider threat scenarios with a focus on obviously protecting against those scenarios in the future. Today, I'm delighted to be the moderator for this session, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to this fantastic group of panelists. Sophia Tyranny is a policy manager at Access Partnership, working in the compliance and market access team. She's an expert in anti-corruption and compliance, and she gets regulatory market access and digital technologies for companies around the world. Additionally, she supports companies with their regulatory compliance processes. Before joining Access Partnership, she worked in many years in multinational companies, think tanks, and anti-corruption divisions at OECD. She has extensive experience in international fields, organizing regional and international campaigns, raising awareness, and building capacities within the government and key stakeholders. She's an Argentinian lawyer from the University of Buenos Aires and holds a master's degree in corruption and governance from Sussex University. Thank you for joining us. Letitia Aduambora is an international ethics compliance professional with significant experience in fast-moving, heavily regulated industries. She has worked in the financial services, telecommunications, fintech, pharmaceuticals, and technology sectors for multinational companies. Her experience includes both Western markets, UK, Europe, and practical on-the-ground experience in emerging markets across Africa. Her focus is implementation of strategies and frameworks and technologies to enable solutions for ethical and compliance in international businesses. She's an Oxford University graduate and a member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, certified compliance and ethics professional, certified lead implementer of ISO 37001, and a master practitioner in neurolinguistics programming. Welcome. Thank you. Additionally, Andres Sacuno, the Director of Forensic Services Practitioner for PwC, serving in Argentina.
Thank you.
Mr. Sarcuno specializes in anti-corruption investigations and forensic accounting matters in Latin America for a diverse group of industries. He's led investigations involving allegations of bribes, kickbacks, fraudulent disbursements, embezzlement, and inventory misappropriation. Additionally, he has worked with other offices in PwC and corporate auditors to conduct FCPA anti-corruption assessments across Latin America. Andres is currently finishing his master's degree in data science. He's an executive MBA of the IAE Business School, a certified public accountant in Argentina, and a certified fraudulent examiner and internal auditor. Welcome, Andre. Well, with that said, let's get on with the topic of today, artificial intelligence and detecting corruption through technologies. Let us begin. So Sophia, to you first. Artificial intelligence is a term that's widely used, but can you help us understand the basic concepts and how it's related to detecting corruption?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Justin, for the question. And also thank you, PC, for the invitation to participate today in such an exciting topic and panel. So AI, it's really interesting. The thing about AI is that whether we like it or we care about it or not, AI is already affecting our lives in different ways. And this is what usually happens with technologies, right? They appear so fast that once we are able to understand them or start understanding them, they have already become something else. So for those of us, like me, for example, who are not tech expert, we are kind of running a race where we are always starting further back. With AI, it happens that there seems to be a lot of information out there, with some media outlets claiming that AI could take all of our jobs in the future, and others presenting it as the panacea for the world's biggest problems. While the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, we cannot deny that AI is at the top of policy agendas for governments and other stakeholders at both national and international levels. So what is AI exactly? We could say it's the ability of a computer or a robot controlled by a computer to do tasks that are usually done by humans because they require human intelligence and discernment. Now, for example, that the EU is discussing the directives around AI, we can see that there are some critics who have questioned the definition of AI in the draft legislation, for example, which largely focuses on machine learning, but may not fully apply to next generation computing technologies. In any case, while agreeing on definition is always a tough task, and we can see that also in the corruption field, that even corruption is totally defined and people are still discussing about the definition, we can at least agree on certain bases. So AI term is used to projects of developing systems and do with intellectual processes. So we consider ability to learn, discover meaning, generalize, learn from the past, adapt to new circumstances, which is very important. And then we have AI systems, which are machine-based systems that are capable of influencing the environment by producing an output, predictions, recommendations, decisions for a given set of objectives. It uses machine or human-based data and inputs to perceive real or virtual environments, abstract these perceptions into models through analysis in an automated or manual manner, and use model interference to formulate options for outcomes. And usually AI systems are designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy. So going to the second part of your question, let's talk about the different use cases of AI and its relation to the fight against corruption. So according to the OECD, for example, AI has 7 different use cases. Today, I'm going to focus only on those that are more relevant to corruption, which are, for example, pattern and anomaly detection, and also one of the most famous, I think, when we think about AI. What is this? This is basically the capacity of identify patterns in the data and higher order connections between data points to see if they fit an existing pattern or if there is any outlier or anomaly. And this is, when we think again on anti-corruption, this is something clearly or easy to see in, for example, law enforcement. They use it to detect financial fraud or money laundering, flagging weird purchases with unusual amounts or locations, also very used for due diligence among bankers as well. So I think this is one of the most common. Then there are also other use cases such as predictive analytics and decision support. This is to understand how past or existing conditions or behaviors can help predict future outcomes to help us make better decisions. And then we have autonomous systems as well, which are physical or virtual software and hardware systems that are able to accomplish a task, reach a goal, interact with their surroundings, and achieve an objective with varying degrees of human involvement. But back to corruption and the relation with AI, we can, in a very simplistic way, I could maybe talk about the fight against anti-corruption or against corruption, sorry, in 3 key areas. I could divide it in prevention, detection, and enforcement. In the anti-corruption field, most of the AI is usually used or has been used in the detection of misconduct, mainly, as I said before, investigators, banks, financial institutions, where red flags or unusual transaction can be identified thanks to the AI and the machine learning processes. For example, me, when I was working at the OECD, I participated in a review of Ukraine, and I remember talking with authorities about the local chapter of TI, Transparency International, has developed its own AI tool to reveal fraudulent bids in public procurement. The name of this tool is .zorro, for example, and it's deployed and they deploy it to monitor the open sources of government procurement system .zorro. So this is a very interesting tool. The Brazilian government also has developed a machine learning application to estimate the risk of corrupt behavior among its civil servants. However, this doesn't mean that AI cannot be used for other anti-corruption purposes, like prevention or enforcement. Using AI to redesign systems previously prone to bribery or corruption is also a very good idea. Enabling AI tools to increase integrity, simplify procedures, or reduce points of interaction may over time undercut opportunities for bribery. So I think it's very interesting to explore these different possibilities beyond maybe the ones we have already seen or we are more aware of, and try to get the best out of it. I think for the sake of time, I'm gonna stop here to allow my colleagues to continue. But in any case, if someone has any specific questions, I am always happy to answer them.
Great, thank you very much. Wow, that was excellent. So Letitia, from what we just heard about what AI is and how it's built, what do you believe the key policies and frameworks are that govern the use of AI when we're talking about detecting corruption?
Sorry, I'm having connection problems. I didn't quite hear you, Justin.
Okay, let me try again. So what do you believe the key policies and frameworks are governing the use of AI in detecting corruption?
Okay, in reference to what Sophia referred to, I mean, I think there are many, many frameworks, and that is essentially the challenge. We have policy frameworks at essentially regional levels, country levels, international individual development type organization level, and also obviously internally in international organizations, individual companies, etc. I mean, I think to take up the issue and the mantle around the specific frameworks, looking at the use cases that Sophia referred to, and also the different applications of AI in the prevention, the detection and enforcement around corruption. I think the key challenges there really relate to the use cases referred to by Sophia. And the policy frameworks in terms of areas such as pattern detection really focus on key areas like the data, the usability of the data, the access of the data, and the institutional implementation framework for the relevant AI policy. In addition, I think also the specifics around the context and the purpose for which the artificial intelligence is being used for the specific detection of anti-corruption activity is also very key. I mean, I think in terms of going back to what Sophia said in terms of autonomy, the policy frameworks and one of the key challenges is really around the level of autonomy of the AI. And that usually starts with assumptions around the design and the build of that AI. Because the policy frameworks may state a certain amount of independence of the AI and the algorithms, which can have potential consequences in implementation, as much of the value in the prevention and detection of anti-corruption comes in the balance of data and results from algorithms, AI, and pattern detection fused with human intelligence to interpret those elements of data. So I think really the key areas of policy frameworks really look at the specific use cases and context around privacy, the accessibility of the information, the representation of the data set, and the inference of deductions made from the results resulting from the artificial intelligence, together with the specific context and values applied to that. And the one point I will say in the context of AI frameworks and policy really starts at the highest level of policy in terms of values, because there are many frameworks, but essentially the values which the policy starts and assumes actually translates to the implementation. And there have been instances where, for example, some of the values starting at the policy level, if you state something like fairness or not creating social harm, the interpretation of that in different social contexts or even different industry applications, whether you're looking at financial crime or abuse of procurement, may actually be different. So I'll hand back to you, Justin.
Great, thank you very much. So Andres, what are the current areas that you're seeing the emergence and success of AI being used for detecting corruption?
Hi, Justin. Well, it's a great question. And let's start saying that think that we are building a machine learning model in compliance with the local legislation and using an appropriate framework. But saying that, thinking if you are, I don't know, the compliance officer of an organization or an internal auditor or a fraud fighter or whatever, the first one I would say it's to analyzing electronic communications, listening to electronic communications, and we have a lot of experience from the Enron case, like 20 years ago. The way that you can apply artificial intelligence is to maybe to analyze or to use sentiment analysis, or saying in other words, it's to read the emails and to identify potential patterns. And for you, it's like to identify a red flag email. Okay, maybe in the past or old school, you have to analyze like 100 or you have to read 100 emails per hour, and you have to flag those potential suspicious emails. Right now, you can perform that using artificial intelligence. Of course, then you need an expert to confirm those cases. But if you build a model using sentiment analysis or using fuzzy matching, or there are different types of techniques to use that. But the first experience, and it's the most successful one, is analyzing the conversations of the employees, or between employees, or between employees and vendors, or between vendors and government officials, and talking about corruption. Of course, maybe you will not find the word bribe in a conversation, but right now you can train machine learning models that they can identify a conversation where they are talking about something similar to asking for a bribe or asking for confidential information or privileged data in order to win a bid. So that's the first one. Second one, I would say you can use artificial intelligence at least to perform a sample of potential suspicious transactions. In order to conduct an investigation or to prevent a corruption scheme, you will analyze the information from the accounting records. And to do that, you will obtain the general ledgers of the company, and then you will analyze at the beginning, applying different business rules in order to identify potential transactions to be analyzed by an expert. Well, you can do that right now, asking for or training a machine learning model that can identify those potential transactions, and then you as an expert will analyze each one. Of course, then you will retrain the model, giving the feedback about the result of the analysis of that specific transaction that was flagged by the training model. Okay. The third one, I would say, of course, I think everybody knows here that using third parties to pay a bribe, it's a very common corruption scheme. So thinking about the due diligence process, you always, as a company, has to define the risk level of those third parties. Of course, that process, you need to gather a lot of data to assign a risk to each of those third parties. Right now, you can use artificial intelligence to assign that risk level to those third parties. But of course, you need a lot of data to do that. And I think that the fourth is, and it's maybe the newest one, is analyzing social networks, or I would say analyzing the business ecosystems of different actors of the company. You have the employees, you have the vendors, you have the clients, you have shareholders, then you have also the relatives of the employees, the relatives of the vendors. Then you have also the relative, well, friends, other companies, and maybe you are, if you are starting doing that, you will have like a huge graph, and then you have to analyze that graph in order to identify a potential conflict of interest or connection between an employee and a vendor. But maybe the connection is like you have 5 layers in order, or 5 links, and in that situation where you have a lot of information, artificial intelligence is very useful in order to predict maybe communities. Thinking about the huge community that you are building, you use artificial intelligence to predict maybe a smaller community where there is a conflict of interest, or they are talking about how to perform a corruption scheme. Okay, and I think we are okay with the time, and I will stop there, Justin.
Great, thank you very much. So the next question has been on my mind quite a bit, and I'm sure it's been on a lot of other people's mind. So what I would like to say, so Sophia, so what are your thoughts on any ethical or integrity concerns related to the use of AI? And what do you think the most common approach to mitigate these are, at least from a policy perspective?
Yes, thanks, Justin, for the question. Indeed, it's a very interesting one, and for me, a very concerning one as well, because when talking about AI, I think we can easily think of a bunch of potential risks. Of course, today I'm going to focus on those related to ethics and integrity. And for me, there are 3 specifically that are the top ones, I would say. The first one is discrimination caused by bias in the algorithms. So risk of AI incorporating human biases through incomplete or inappropriately biased data sets, or through the algorithm design itself, could potentially infringe the right to non-discrimination. I remember a couple of years ago, I came here to Paris, before I used to live here. I came for a conference to attend the Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum. And I remember in the opening session, there it was Delia Ferreira, who is the chair of Transparency International. And she was talking exactly about this. She was talking about how important and dangerous can be to make our decisions from AI processes based on algorithms that we don't know and that can clearly carry the bias of their creators. So how to make those algorithms more transparent in order to protect the users. At the time, I remember she was arguing about the importance of, as I said, of transparency, accountability in the design of the algorithms, but also in the control of them. And this can actually be very tricky, because the thing about bias is that we hardly recognize them. We have conscious but also unconscious bias. So working on them to avoid discrimination, it is really a challenge. On top of this, I also watched a very interesting documentary that talks about the bias, for example, in facial recognition that use AI. In this documentary, it is very well explained how algorithms can be built with the biases of their creators, because the film or the documentary talks about or shows a facial analysis system that fails to register the engineer's face that was talking and explaining the case until she puts on a white mask. And this is an eye-opening visual metaphor for me for how technology perpetuates the biases of the people who make them. And this example also shines a light on the worryingly unregulated power exerted by algorithms, data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all doing the biasing of programmers and engineers who are passing unconsciously sometimes their own biases. Again, conscious and unconscious is bias. So for me, discrimination is clearly the #1 risk to tackle and to care about. The second one would be privacy. AI applications require large amounts of data, creating a risk that law enforcement and intelligence agencies make illegitimate requests or demands for personal information. Companies can collect, use, and share a person's personally identifiable information without informed consent. Of course, this is connected as well with GDPR and other data protection rules. But maybe what I would like to highlight here is that sometimes these legislations comes a bit late, because as I said before, technology moves so fast that by the time that there is a regulation, maybe it's already a bit old. Third one, I would say freedom of opinion as a risk, and I connect this directly with whistleblower protection, which also is one of the key points when we talk about the fight against corruption. And for me, what I'm trying to say here is that artificial intelligence might adversely impact these rights of freedom of opinion and expression in different ways. For example, there is a risk that human rights, anti-corruption activists, whistleblowers self-censor their expressions if they fear being surveilled. At the same time, for example, risk of AI bots influencing social media with misinformation or biased views and opinions. It's also another sub-item within the risk against freedom. And some of you might remember what happened to a AI chatbot developed by a very famous tech company a couple of years ago. They launched this AI chatbot on Twitter. This chatbot had some vulnerabilities in the code. So in few hours, it learned from the very hard and wild ecosystem of Twitter, and it ended up being a racist misogynist. So they had to close it the same day because users were feeding the machine with all their hate speech, and of course the chatbot was replicating that, because basically what I said before, among the different use of AI, it based on the information and the data that it has. So when this chatbot received all this horrible hate speech, it just replicated it. More recently, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, another very famous voice assistant suggested a 10-year-old girl to touch a coin to the prongs of a half-inserted plus. And again, the company fixed the error as soon as they became aware of it. But my point here is that there are a lot of risk, and there will remain being a lot of risk because we are using a technology that is still constantly under development and improvement. AI is here to stay for sure, and it will become even more relevant with the development and deployment of upcoming technologies. Now we have countries deploying 5G that will enable Internet of Things, the famous IoT, and therefore then will come the metaverse, for example. So we really need to ensure that we have good policies in these areas before being too late. And maybe the second part of your question, Justin, about common approach to deal with this risk. What would I say from a policy perspective is that the most common approach is to develop and implement principles for ethical and rights respecting AI to ensure trustworthy AI. So AI guidances and principles from companies and governments are fundamental. So, and for me, it's very curious, and coming from the compliance and anti-corruption field, when I used to work in the private sector, I remember working for this big multinational company, and at the time there were countries that didn't have anti-corruption regulations or law in terms of bribing a foreign official, which is the base of the FCPA, for example. So companies were implementing, this company in particular was implementing an internal policy that had higher standards than the countries that they were developing their businesses. And something similar is happening also with AI now. So we see that certain legislations are starting to flourish, but clearly there is not a strict policy regulation so far. What some companies are doing at least is start to publish their own guidelines or code of ethics in terms of AI. What is important to mention, I think, is that to implement principles, there are certain steps that must be taken, whether it's governments, international organizations, or companies. So they need or they must conduct impact assessment on emerging technologies, and this assessment should be related to human rights, corruption, ESG, discrimination, so all the topics we have been discussing so far. they need driving collaboration and dialogue through industry and multi-stakeholder platforms. So engagement from different actors is also fundamental to build these principles and these rules around AI. Putting in place governance structures such as internal review committees, open consultations, this is also fundamental, and advocating for public policy aimed at mitigating this type of risk related to AI. Regarding, for example, legal framework, we can talk about the European Union and what they are doing. So to further ensure trustworthy AI, most governments are adopting new legislative frameworks for AI technologies which are often sector specific and cover areas such as autonomous driving, healthcare, e-justice, but also several governments are setting up regulatory sandboxes offering control environment for AI experimentation and testing. Because I want to be clear about this point, regulations, I think it's very important to have control and regulations, but at the same time, these regulations should or must enable the development of the AI, because this is something that, as I said before, it's already here, it's already in our life. So the important thing is to find the right balance. And the European Commission presented recently the proposal for a European regulatory approach on AI, adopting a risk-based attitude with strict rules for high-risk systems. So this proposed regulation is a move against aggressive surveillance and bias in AI organisms, and it tried to demonstrate Europe's commitment, at least, with the protection of individual rights. At the same time, as I mentioned now, the controversy lies on the balance between protecting people and reducing risk, but also enabling the technology to develop further. So trying to avoid the heavy barriers to AI uptake and innovation. Last week or 2 weeks ago, and also if gently our assistant from PCB can maybe drop the link to this article that I would like to share with the audience. Jordan announced the public consultation on the draft National Charter of Artificial Intelligence Ethics. So this is a good example of what I was mentioning before, the importance of having open consultation, engagement from different actors in society. So this National Charter aims to support the application of artificial intelligence technologies within ethical principles in the country and introduces a set of guidelines. Those guidelines promote the rule of law, human rights, democratic values, diversity, which is fundamental, inclusiveness, privacy, protection of data. And on top of that, this draft national charter also provides principles relating to the virtual environment and the metaverse. And I think this is very interesting because, as I said before, AI, today we're talking about AI and anti-corruption, but in maybe 5 years or probably less, PCB will be organizing another forum to talk about how to avoid corruption in the metaverse or how to detect corruption in the metaverse. So if we do the things right today in terms of regulation and setting the limits and putting the boundaries for all the risks that I mentioned before, maybe in the future, the very near future, when we will be working on anti-corruption in this virtual or parallel world reality, the work is going to be easy because we need to be very conscious on the importance of these regulations today. So tomorrow the things are going to be easier for us. So this is a very interesting example, as I said before, and I hope people can access to this article to read a bit more about it. But main topics, for example, in this charter on ethics and AI cover humanity and society, inclusiveness and justice, importance to respect and protect the diversity, inclusion, impartiality, transparency, responsibility and accountability, etc. And maybe I would like to close with my idea, I would like to highlight this word transparency, because transparency is not only opening information or giving formulas to the user so they can understand. Transparency is connected with explainability. because not most of us, but me, for example, I am a lawyer. I am not an engineer. I don't really understand all the formulas behind the algorithms. So me, in order to hold people accountable for the use of AI and implications in my life and understand how it affects me, I need to have meaningful information in the appropriate context and consistent with the state of art. So me as a normal person, can also, as I said, I can also understand the AI systems. I can also be aware of the interactions I have with AI systems. I can understand how I am affected, and especially for those adversely affected by AI systems, we need to have the possibility to challenge its outcome based on a plain, easy to understand information on the factors and the logic that serve as the basis of the prediction and the recommendation or the decisions made based on the AI tools. So, I don't know how long, maybe I need to stop here, but I think that this was the concept I wanted to highlight specifically, because AI actors must provide an explanation on the outcomes in a clear and simple terms. And again, as appropriate to the context of the users and the people that is affected by the AI tools. And this is something interesting. Back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Sophia. So kind of to build on that, Leticia, what do you think the practical applications are to protect ourselves from, the ethical concerns against, AI being used to detect corruption?
Well, Justin, I think just to pick up, before we go into the implementation, I actually think we need to start at the policy level, actually, to protect ourselves at the practical implementation, because I think the creation of policies and the policy frameworks which are there to guide us at present talk of very high-level principles, which I appreciate policy can only do, things like protection of human rights, etc., but do not to date stress enough on making it context specific and culturally specific in terms of whatever approach and implementation of the policy. And I think that is what also leads to some of the challenges we have today in the risks that Sophia talked about in actual application and implementation, things like discrimination, etc., because the key to actually protecting ourselves against things like discrimination or biases caused by inappropriate data sets or inappropriate infringes on privacy is by starting off making the application of the AI to detect corruption very context specific. And I think this comes back to what Sophia touched on in terms of taking a risk-based approach, because if you do that, then you have to be very clear as to what is the purpose of this AI, what elements of corruption are we trying to either prevent or detect or enforce against, and therefore you then create your specific artificial intelligence for whatever specific context and purpose. And that would take out some of the challenges that we face. So it starts at the policy level by making a requirement that rather than just these broad principles, which are great, but are subject to interpretation in different contexts and different cultures and different situations, the need to first of all look at the specifics of the situation. I'd then like to touch on some of the points made about obviously the biases that come from inappropriateness of data. I think once again, if we have the context right, it's about looking at the accessibility of the data and making sure that essentially the appropriate privacy requirements are taken into account, but also the appropriate data is made accessible to in order an effective data set for the specific situation. And I think also we need to be clear on the quality of the data as well. It needs to be appropriate in terms of validating it for the specific situation. So, I think we've had situations of, specifically in AI and anti-corruption, we need to be very clear because obviously when mistakes are made and you're dealing with false positives, either individuals or institutions are being inappropriately accused of something. Similarly, you can have the other side of the coin where essentially you do get the correct positives, but the constant bombardment of this information to either citizens or the public has an adverse impact on people's behavior, either through weariness or giving up, or even feeling that it gives them justification essentially to bypass specific ethical norms. So that the impact of the AI and the impact assessment, as Sophia referred to, is critical before actually these algorithms and the specific AI are implemented. I think the key thing for me in relation to how we protect moving forward, and we'll come to this in the future, is not just algorithmic impact assessment, but essentially algorithmic trials. And I'll make this final point. We've all had a headache before in our lives. We all have the common headache tablet we go and get over the counter. But the bottom line is, if the provider of that headache tablet was to tell us in detail every single chemical, how they mixed it, how they made it, and give us full transparency, for the majority of us, that means nothing. You know, they could tell us all the chemical components. However, what we do know, or what we trust, is that that drug has been tried, and we know that if we have a headache, we go and take that tablet, and it solves the headache for the majority of us. And there may be an element of the population where there are contraindications or may not work. That trust we have has been established by a framework for essentially drug trials, and essentially I think we will get to the stage where AI and its effectiveness, either in anti-corruption or otherwise, will have to go through trials to enable us to have the trust and the understanding, whether it's business, public sector, private sector, of what the outcome is, so that we know that we're going to get the specific outcome we want from the specific AI and the data set used. That is what will be true transparency, because as Sophia intimated, giving us all the data and the volumes doesn't help. And also it's actually the inferences and the outcome of the use of that data that we're interested in. And we can't make that adjustment until it's been proven. So I think ultimately what would take this forward will be the not just algorithmic impact assessments, but actual AI and algorithmic trials for specific contexts.
Great,
I'll
thank you.
stop there.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, Andres, what do you think the future holds for us when it comes to AI and detecting corruption? Look in your crystal ball, what can you tell us about it?
Well, do you know that it's a very difficult question, but let me see and try to answer that saying this. First of all, it's a fact that we right now we have a lot of data, and you will have even more data available in order to analyze or identify suspicious transactions. But of course, data privacy and bias want to be challenged, and you have to work thinking that you have to be in compliance with basically data privacy. That's, I think, the first issue. In the future, you will use artificial intelligence as a daily tool to fight against corruption. If you know anything about machine learning today, I would say after this conference, you have to start studying about that, okay? Because as a compliance officer, or you will use this every day. Of course, a hotline or walking the talks are gonna be always the key to fight corruption. I think you will use one or maybe a couple of algorithms to prevent corruption, but there are two ways to build an algorithm. You can use supervised learning, or you can use unsupervised learning, or you can use a model that then you can explain the results, and then you have other type of algorithms that you cannot explain the results or the way the model arrives to that result. So I would say this. I think if you are fighting corruption and you are tagging transactions, always you have to be in a position to explain why you are tagging that transaction or that electronic communication or that invoice or that third party or that employee that could be potentially involved in a corruption scheme. So saying that, I think a takeaway of this today conference is you have to understand how a logistic regression works. It's a type of algorithm to train a model, thinking about supervised learning, okay? And on the other hand, then you will have deep learning. If you apply deep learning, you will not have enough information to explain why the algorithm tagged that transaction. So from my point of view, in the future, we will continue exploring ways to apply algorithms that you can explain why you are selecting those transactions. And at the end of the day, thinking about anti-corruption, you don't need a very sophisticated algorithm. You really need its appropriate data. That's why I'm telling to you that data privacy is one of the biggest concerns of the future. Because in order to identify a suspicious transaction, you need data, and you need more data and more data and more data. And I think if you are someone that is as an expert and you are trying to build an algorithm, you need to think about features that allow you to identify those transactions. And to build those features, you have to be an expert, but you have also must to acquire knowledge about how a logistic regression works. But again, right now we are thinking about the corruption schemes of the last 10 years, and you build a model. But right now you have to work for the future corruption schemes. So definitely they're going to be different to the those in the past, because right now you have an algorithm to detect those in the past. So you have to every time training the model to have the capacity to identify those future potential suspicious transactions. And in another hand, I would say that also you will have a problem. The algorithms are trained by human beings. So in the future, you will have corrupted algorithms. If I change a couple of features or metrics, or I change the script, you can build an algorithm that could be corrupted. So you also have to have the ability to understand algorithms in order to look for a corrupted line in the script that would change the entire result of the algorithm. So that's another huge challenge. You have to have the ability to understand an algorithm and say, oh, be careful here. We have to have a meeting with the team in order to understand. Tell me, how do you do this? What data do you take? Why you? Because when you are building a model, you make a lot of decisions, and that's why also Sophia talked about bias. You make a lot of decisions in the middle of the process to have an algorithm. So you have to think about that. And I think I stop here. We can speak a lot about the future and the challenge, but remember this: logistic regression, or maybe random forest, those keywords and always try to build something that you can explain. Deep learning is excellent, but you cannot explain the outcome. Okay.
Great, thank you very much. So now we have a few questions from our attendees. So I'll just throw them out there and we'll see what we got. Let me see. Okay, Sophia, do you believe that we should start with a risk assessment before engaging in our AI?
Sorry, I was checking if I was muted or not. I think that yes, my easy answer would be yes. I think that anytime you start using a new technology or you implement a new process, especially in anti-corruption, whether it is AI or a new training or a new hotline, I think it's always useful to do a risk assessment, because whether things go right or wrong, if you do a risk assessment, you have a starting point to compare. And this is also part of what maybe Andres was mentioning before, like being able to explain your decisions and doing a good risk assessment will be part of that explanation and justification of the decisions that you make. So that would be my broader answer. And also maybe on top of that, to be aware that, as I said before, there are different type of risk assessments. We can have if we go very into details, and also this depends on the company, right? Not all companies have the same risk, so therefore probably the risk concerning AI will also be different. But it's important to visualize exactly if you want to measure, as I said before, risk concretely on human rights or environmental, or I don't know, something specifically on corruption, data privacy. I think each of these topics have become so big and important that we cannot englobe them all in one, like in one bag. So that is also a second point to keep in mind, I think, when doing this kind of risk assessments.
Great, thank you. Letitia, what do you think about this? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to add to what you were saying, I mean, in terms of whether risk assessments, I think where we are traditionally, yes. I think the battle we face, maybe Andreas can comment on this later, is the issue of speed. Because I think when it comes to artificial intelligence, the fight against corruption and the use of AI for anti-corruption purposes, risk assessments in the traditional way that we might think of them in compliance frameworks today, where you do the risk assessment before you design and build what you're going to use. I think we're in a world where ultimately that time may not be afforded to us in many of the uses and ways we want to use AI for anti-corruption purposes. Which is why it brings me back to almost like having this framework of either existing impact assessments or trials for the most common instances or occurrences or future scenarios, so that those may be the default situation, and then you can build on risk assessments on that when you have something to work with. I think my only comment really would be around the speed as to whether the world will allow us that time, given how quickly we need to deploy nowadays for the risk assessments.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have a very interesting question here. How about you, Andres? What do you think of this? Can results from AI be used as evidence in court?
Well, I am not a legal counsel. I think I am not in a position to respond to that. It's at the end of the day, in court, you will show the evidence of a transaction that you analyze, and you said that maybe it could be flagged as a potential corruption scheme, and I stop there. I apologize, but I am not in a position.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that, or have seen this in the past?
Because the results are the evidence that you identify. You use artificial intelligence to figure out the potential communications, emails, but at the end of the day, you will show to the court the email or the smoking gun. You will not show the the artificial intelligence model that you built in order to identify that transaction. I don't know if someone else had to add something else, but
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, I would say that ultimately it could only be used as evidence if there has been a human decision. And therefore you can establish where the accountability lies if we take legal frameworks. I think the challenge will come, and we don't know where the law will go in this regard, if you can't establish accountability and who or what was responsible for that specific inference on the data or that specific decision.
Okay, and here's kind of a question that builds on that. Can we ever trust an AI to produce error-free results, or do we still always need to have that human eye to look at them?
I take that. You need someone, a human being, analyzing the results. I would say yes. I will say for the following 10 years, yes. For the following 20 years, yes. We are so far for that. Okay. Yes, you always need someone, a human being, analyzing the results of those potential suspicious transactions. Okay.
Absolutely great. Okay, another question we have here is, could we remove the human aspect and complete a complete digital audit for ISO 37001? Would that be more successful or possible?
Can answer again if someone...
Absolutely, please go ahead.
I would say you can use technology for most of the processes that you have to complete for that audit, but no, you need a human being, of course, because you have to make a couple of interviews, feel the culture. It's very difficult saying that those days to no. My answer is no, you cannot.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm not a practitioner again. I'm more like in the regulatory side, but I wouldn't even trust. Sometimes I'm drafting a Word document. I'm not even trusting the grammar corrector. So trusting fully technology on whether there is a corruption or a misconduct without the analysis of someone else. It's not because I'm a perfectionist, but I think I wouldn't trust it only on that. I think it's a very useful tool if it's used correctly. But considering all the examples that I mentioned before as well, and all the biases that we have been discussing, I think we are not even close from only relying on technology per se. But we need to understand them, we need to get used to them, but I wouldn't say it's a fully reliable tool 100%.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll just add to that. I mean, obviously, we don't know what the future holds, but I think we can maybe take some lessons from the instances where technology has been allowed to make decisions without human checks. And I mean, we all know, whether it's in the States or in various elements of Europe, if we take the financial sector, where, for example, credit decisions have been made, great big databases and data sets have been used to make decisions around people's credit profiles, et cetera, and there have been situations where that has resulted in, profiling of specific sectors of society with the ultimate ramifications of that. So we can look to what we know, which is the situations where AI and algorithms in technology has been allowed to make decisions unchecked. And to date, we don't seem to have too many successful examples of that.
I would say you cannot complete an audit without technology. Okay, you have to change the okay.
Let me see if I can fit in one more question here. So, is there a current process or framework using machine learning or deep learning that we can actually use to solve these anti-corruption problems, or are they all bespoke, software at this point?
Can you rephrase it?
Like, is there an actual framework? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I understood that the question referred like if there is like a magical tool of AI that can solve corruption, and if it exists, I think clearly we're not using it, so I would assume that it doesn't. But I'm not sure if I understood correctly the question. So
Yeah, no, that was
you
it.
have something for the past. Right now, you can find a couple of magic tools, if you want to use that word, for all corruption schemes. But right now, there is someone thinking out the new way to pay a bribe. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll end on that note. I want to thank everyone for attending this artificial intelligence detecting corruption through technologies, and a very big thank you to our excellent group of panelists for answering all these questions. Greatly appreciate it. I'd like to wish everyone have a great day, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.